This year, a record number of people will be turning 65, and the next year, that record will be broken again. We have been warned about aging populations for decades now, and now it's actually happening. Unfortunately, the savings retirement gap for millions of households is wider than it has ever been, and people's assets have been eaten up by inflation, bad investments, and good old-fashioned financial illiteracy. Over 20% of the people on the cusp of retirement have no savings at all, but that isn't stopping them. Millions of people across the world can't afford to retire, and they're doing it anyway. So what the f does this mean for everybody else?
Baby boomers leaving their homes either because they're moving to assisted living centers or they're just no longer living.
In the last 10 years, Milwaukee County saw a 22% increase of older residents.
In their 50s are generally at peak earning potential, yet more than half worry they'll run out of money in retirement.
Is this the retirement that you imagined?
No.
Earlier this year, the Retirement Income Institute released a commissioned study on retirement savings. And I can't overemphasize how much I love the name of this report, Peak Boomers Impact Study found that between this year and 2030, 30 million Americans will retire, representing almost a fifth of the total labor force. The study focused primarily on how those retirees plan to fund their retirement, and the results were grim. More than half of the study group had less than $250,000 in assets, including their home if they had one. And that group would rely on Social Security as their primary or exclusive source of income in retirement. Now, this study was conducted by independent researchers, but it was funded by a group that wants to sell annuities to people planning their retirement. So some of the recommendations need to be taken with more than a bucket of salt. However, the study group of retirees getting too old to work are just one part of the larger group deciding that right now is a pretty good time to retire. A study by Pew Research has found that the largest wave of retirement has already happened, as people step back from the workforce during COVID, assisted by a combination of record low interest rates, generous stimulus measures, redundancy packages, record asset prices, and a general motivation to not go back into a plague-infested office. This is far from a uniquely American trend. In fact, we are actually behind a lot of countries that are both older than us and have better support systems for people in their old age. On top of hitting peak boomer, there are less typical retirees. A growing number of independently wealthy young people who are pursuing financial independence where investment returns from their assets are enough to fund their lifestyle indefinitely, and on the other end of the spectrum, there are people just giving up on working and are scraping by on family support, government assistance, or jobs in the informal economy. These people aren't the typical demographic of retirees, but they are still adding to the record trend, and they are all paying for this major financial decision in slightly different ways. The first way is that they just aren't. People don't always make entirely rational financial decisions. Whether it's buying a car in an 84-month finance deal, racking up credit card debt to buy luxury goods, or just not understanding the importance of saving and investing, there is no shortage of people doing really dumb things with their money. You are watching a channel that gives weekly depressing lectures on the state of the financial system, business trends, and the economy. So all of you are probably far more financially literate than the average person. And even then, you have probably made some dumb money mistakes. People deciding to quit their jobs often aren't thinking entirely rationally. And more people are just deciding that if they are going to be screwed financially in their old age, they would at least like to enjoy a few years while they still have their health and worry about finances once they are too old for it to be their problem. For some people, the decision is made for them. Layoffs nationwide have hit people approaching retirement age particularly hard. According to a survey conducted by the Trans-America Center for Retirement Studies, most Americans are retiring 5 years earlier than they expected. While this sounds like it's giving people more years to enjoy themselves, the reality is that it's giving people fewer years to save and more years to cover. And this is almost entirely involuntary. According to a study published by ProPublica, since 2016, 56% of workers over the age of 50 lost their job involuntarily, meaning they either got fired, made redundant, or laid off. Now, that might not sound too bad, but you have to remember that a lot of people over the age of 50 are choosing to leave their job because they are retiring on their own terms. So the majority being let go is pushing a lot of people out of work. Once they are out, older people are finding it much harder to find a job, especially ones that pay as well as the jobs they were laid off from. Companies don't want to hire older people because they think that they can't use computers, they aren't going to be able to do physical work for as long as young workers in non-office jobs, and there is the not-so-secret reality that older workers are normally less easy to take advantage of than younger workers with their whole career ahead of them. It's technically not legal to discriminate against workers over the age of 40, although this law does not protect against discriminating against people under the age of 40. But that's a whole separate issue. It doesn't matter anyway, because any half-competent hiring manager or human resources department would find a reason for hiring a young worker instead of an over 50 worker, and this all means the same thing. If people lose their jobs over the age of 50, they are almost forced into retirement whether they can afford it or not. So it's time to learn how money works to find out what this means for everybody else supporting a growing group of people who can't support themselves. This week's lesson is sponsored by Cook Unity. Here's how it usually works. Potential sponsors reach out to me, I try the product, and then decide if I want to work with them. This time though, it's a little different. I've actually been using Cook Unity for a while now, and I loved it so much that I was excited to partner with them. Cook Unity makes it easy and effortless. You can pick a subscription plan and choose from hundreds of meals each week, all crafted by award-winning chefs. Don't have time to choose? No worries. Cook Unity can curate meals based on your preferences. Cook Unity's roster of all-star chefs include Food Network alums, James Beard Award winners, and acclaimed restaurateurs. Their meals come fully cooked, so you just heat them up. You can choose between 4 to 16 meals per week, and the plans are super flexible. You can skip weeks, pause, or cancel anytime. Subscriptions start as low as $11 a meal, which is a steal for restaurant-quality food. For example, I'm enjoying the Korean flank steak rice bowl by Esther Choi. Absolutely incredible. Honestly, it feels like having a personal chef that changes daily based on your cravings. Go to cookunity.com/money50 or click the link in the description and use my code MONEY50 to get 50% off your first order of Cook Unity meals to try them out for yourself. The topic of what to do with aging populations in countries across the world is something that is keeping a lot of policymakers up at night. People are living longer and having fewer children, which means more pressure is going to be put on a smaller group of young people, or elderly people are going to have to make do with less. Of course, a lot of baby boomers are independently very wealthy as they have enjoyed a high level of job security and incredible asset price appreciation over their working careers. A typical white-haired couple driving a gold buggy around a gated Floridian retirement village might be the first thing you think of when you think of boomer retirees. But these people are far from the average. People of retirement age own more than half of the wealth of the country, but that wealth is spread even more unevenly than it is over the general population. There are some extremely wealthy baby boomers, a small group of boomers who will be able to comfortably fund a nice retirement, and millions who are fighting for what little is left. The question is really about what happens when this group just can't work anymore. A study by the Stanford Center on Longevity found that even though baby boomers are the wealthiest generation in history as a whole, they are still facing tougher retirement conditions on an individual basis than their parents did. Some countries are pushing back retirement ages to squeeze a few more years of work out of people before they can receive a government pension or access their Advantage retirement savings accounts. Statistically, most of you watching this video are either at the peak of your career or are only just starting, which is why we have covered the problems you are likely to face if you don't already have a solid plan to retire. But even if pushing back retirement benefits is a necessary evil, it's going to be a hard sell. Retiring baby boomers are a large group, and they vote. The very mention of them needing to work a few more years is borderline political suicide. Most plans here in America center around pushing back retirement for young people who aren't close enough to retirement yet to care. Whatever the plan is, it's not being helped by the millions of people who are dropping out of the workforce. So, the compromise is that the payments are stretched thinner. According to Census Bureau data, poverty rates amongst people over 65 has been on the rise as government programs haven't been able to keep up with general inflation, and certainly haven't kept up with the spiraling costs for aged healthcare and senior living. If people do re-enter the workforce, it's normally into low-wage jobs that only help support other payments. A study conducted by the American Society of Aging found that a fifth of older workers were making less than $15 an hour, and that included people between 55 and 65 who should be at the penultimate years of their career. The authors of this study also pointed out that a lot of this low-wage work is intense, routine, and almost always highly monitored in situations where a person controls neither the pace nor content of their work. Now, you probably don't need an institutional study to tell you that minimum wage jobs are hard. But they are even harder on old people with deteriorating health, which means it can be hard for them to keep this work even if they really need it. When this happens, the last line of support becomes relying on their adult children for care. Now, the idea of your parents moving back in with you might be terrifying enough, but the burden of being a caregiver to elderly parents is disproportionately falling on lower-income households. Lower-income households are less likely to be able to save adequately for retirement and are more likely to have children that are also low income. When those parents start requiring care from the children, it can impact relationships, career growth, or even how many hours the adult child can put into their work. Additionally, a dependent parent might be a direct financial burden if their assistance payments don't cover their expenses. This means the children are going to be less likely to save for their own retirement, creating a vicious intergenerational cycle. So what was supposed to be a feel-good story about millions of people leaving behind the 9-to-5 has turned into a lecture about the grim financial landscape that millions of people are forced to contend with. Welcome to this channel. By now, you should know what you have signed up for. But what can be done about this? As a society, not much, unfortunately. A lot of incredibly smart people are tackling the problem of aging populations, and the solutions so far have been to get people to work longer and live on less. Individually, though, you need to assume that there is not going to be anything there to support you when you are too old to work. Pensions are already strained, and if you have a few decades left in the workforce, there really is no guarantee it will exist at all for you. And if it does, it's probably only going to be enough to cover the bare necessities, if that. So try to set something aside in a 401k or whatever the equivalent is in your respective countries. It's basic stuff, but when so many people cannot or will not do the basics, it could put you a long way ahead. Now, this only applies to elderly retirees. This problem is being made much worse by the millions of people leaving the workforce decades before they would normally retire. Go and watch my video on why millions of men are simply choosing not to work and how they are surviving without even any of the supports available to regular retirees. And don't forget, if you want to get these videos a day early and stories that will never go up here on YouTube, subscribe to my email newsletter to keep on learning how money works.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. 2008 was a pretty interesting year. It was my first year of university. The iPhone was 1 year old. Dubstep was about to explode, and Breaking Bad changes television. But what most people remember from 2008 was the financial disaster that came with it. The world would go through one of the biggest crises it had ever witnessed. $19.2 trillion of household wealth would be lost, and some of the biggest financial institutions in the world would fail. The crisis would mark everyone who lived through it. Without knowing it, many have had their lives determined by this recession. From the backlash against globalization to the erosion of trust in governments, financial institutions, and each other, it can all be traced back to this point in time. Since the recession, less people are having kids, and it's been harder to get by. And I'm even talking before COVID. The 2008 crisis was the death of the real economy. After that point, there was less productivity and more money printing and low interest rates, which disproportionately helped the richest people. With the way the global economy is looking today, it's increasingly important to look back at this point in history to understand exactly what happened and the parallels it has to today. This special episode will be split into 3 parts. First, I'll take you through the setup of the disaster, then the crash, then the death of the real economy, and I'll finish with what you can do to help yourself. Let's begin the story of one of the biggest events in human history.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
Vengeance is a cruel mistress. We dare not stray from our path. Our confidence wavers.
To get the full picture, we need to go back to America in 1995. During this year, the fight was on to help low-income earners. The US government passed laws to decrease discrimination against poorer home borrowers. The banks would lower lending requirements, offering packages such as reduced payments for a number of years. Soon after, in 1999, the US government repealed a law that stopped commercial banks from taking part in investment banking activities. The law that they got rid of was the Glass-Steagall Act. Ironically, this law was made in 1933 to stop the speculation that fueled the Great Depression. It was a fatal mistake. From 1999 onwards, banks which had previously managed conservatively turned to riskier and riskier investments, as well as speculation, all in an effort to increase their returns. Banks cared less about their customers and more about Wall Street profits. According to Nobel economics laureate Joseph Stiglitz, this move played a major role in the financial collapse that was to come. But why worry? Right now, things were good. It was the late 1990s, and there were seemingly no economic problems in sight for America. The internet had taken over the minds of everyone. Investment banks were throwing money behind anything that had a .com at the end. The result was the launch of stupid companies like Pets.com. The banks didn't care though. When the stock went up, they would sell and make their profit. This was the .com bubble, and it had arrived in full force. People quit their jobs to trade stocks, and shares went crazy. For example, shares of Qualcomm rose by 2,619% in 1999 alone. In America, there was money to be made, and life was good. But something started to happen. Soon investors realized that these internet companies had no cash flow and couldn't actually make any money, and by March 2000, it all came crashing down. The next year, the September 11th attacks would occur, followed by the Enron and WorldCom corporate accounting scandals. After these events, the public and the markets lost trust in the economy. Spending trended downwards, and it was looking like the economy was heading for a recession. To avoid this, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, decided to lower interest rates down to 1%. The low interest rates would increase spending and recover confidence in the American economy. With a low 1% interest rate and no systemic problems in the real economy, the recovery was rapid and economic growth was ample. Eventually, speculation started to migrate from stocks into real estate. By 2003, everyone with a good credit score and a good job already owned a home. If you were in the business of giving out home loans, this was a bad sign. To save their profit margins, mortgage lenders relaxed credit scores to get more people in the door and increase profits. These were called subprime loans. As the money flowed in and time went on, the lending standards got lower and lower and lower. Soon there were mortgage deals that required no income, no job, and no assets.
They stopped checking whether the income was even real. They turned to low and no doc loans, so-called liar's loans. No income, no job, no assets, and they were still willing to lend.
But help me out here. How does that make sense for the lender? It would seem to be reckless in the extreme.
It was, but the key assumption was that home prices would keep going up forever. And in fact, home prices nationwide had never declined since the Great Depression.
People like acupuncturist Rula Geosmis became real estate speculators.
How many properties did you buy in this last 5-year period?
I believe in the last 5-year period I bought about 6 properties.
And what did you buy them for?
For investments.
If a subprime customer defaulted, it was no problem. Just sell the house because it was going to go up in value, so you're going to still make a profit.
The anima are restless. Our will shall
So this next part is a bit in the weeds, but I need you to bear with me because it's crucial to the story. So Wall Street was looking at this situation and they saw an opportunity. You see, there were 2 groups of people that could be linked here. On the one side were the mortgage lenders, who were profiting from a newly found market. They wanted to get rid of these risky loans because they knew that these loans were junk and had a huge liability. On the other hand, you had institutional investors who were looking for ways to increase their returns. Since interest rates were low at 1%, high-yield products were off the table. The Wall Street banks had an idea, and they got to work offering the perfect high-yielding product, the mortgage-backed security. These are a bundle of individual mortgage debts sold as shares. These shares would give back the investors that bought them a safe, fixed income. Some rather devious bankers realized that they could use an old financial tool in combination with mortgage-backed securities to make unimaginable amounts of money. If they used this tool in the housing market, they could make tens of billions of dollars in just months. This tool was the CDO, collateralized debt obligation. To give you an idea of how lovely these products were, the bank that invented them went bankrupt due to a massive insider trading scandal. One way to imagine a CDO product is to think of it as a box. This box gets filled with monthly repayments from a group of mortgages and other debt, such as car loans and student loans. The box can generate income to investors who buy it. It's divided into different levels. Each level represents a different risk.
A CDO works like 3 cascading trays. As money comes in, the top tray fills first, then spills over into the middle, and whatever is left into the bottom. The money comes from homeowners paying off their mortgages. If some owners don't pay and default on their mortgage, less money comes in and the bottom tray may not get filled. This makes the bottom tray riskier and the top tray safer. To compensate for the higher risk, the bottom tray receives a higher rate of return, while the top receives a lower, but still nice return.
The aim of this was to diversify the risk, but there was a fatal flaw. Since the box had safe prime home loans mixed in with loans to people who had no job, the whole thing was risky. All of the risk was passed to investors who purchased these debt boxes. Meanwhile, the lenders and the banks profited handsomely by charging high fees.
This system was a ticking time bomb. Lenders didn't care anymore about whether a borrower could repay, so they started making riskier loans. The investment banks didn't care either. The more CDOs they sold, the higher their profits.
As the financial assets became more complex and harder to value, the majority didn't understand how these instruments worked. They turned to credit rating agencies for clarity. The hope was that these institutions would do their homework for them and determine risk correctly. But as it goes, the rating agencies completely screwed up. They rated these debt boxes as AAA, the highest possible rating. This signaled that they were extremely safe, good enough for pension funds and the wider economy to invest in. But there's a question remaining. Why did the rating agencies rate these debt boxes as high quality? Well, sadly, it was because the rating agencies made billions of dollars in doing so. If a bank came to them asking to rate their box filled with junk, a rating agency would know that if they gave the product the true junk rating, the banks would just go to another rating agency down the road to get the AAA rating they desired. Rating all of these boxes AAA meant that the money kept flowing into the rating agencies. This was another key component to the disaster. These false ratings would later spread America's problems to the rest of the world. Between 2000 and 2007, the subprime mortgage debt included in the packages increased from 5% to 36%. They saw remarkable success, growing from an estimated $20 billion in 2004 to over $180 billion in 2007. Bankers were personally making millions to tens of millions in bonuses. While this was going on, there were some mad scientists in the financial industry that were creating financial weapons of mass destruction. This is where things go insane, and the greed was in full swing. The final stage of the greed was the invention of the mortgage credit default swap. This was a financial instrument that worked as insurance against failed mortgage debt products.
So it's an insurance contract.
It is an insurance contract, but they've been very careful not to call it that. Because if it were insurance, it would be regulated.
This is actually the security.
This is the selling document for the securities.
Think anybody ever read this stuff?
I doubt very many people read it.
These complex financial instruments were actually designed by mathematicians and physicists who used algorithms and computer models to reconstitute the unreliable loans in ways that were supposed to eliminate most of the risk.
Obviously, they turned out to be wrong.
Why?
Because you can't model human behavior with math.
They are complex, in effect, mortgage science projects devised by these Nobel-track physicists who came to work on Wall Street.
And it didn't stop Wall Street from making billions selling them to banks, pension funds, and other institutional investors all over the world.
How big is the market for credit default swaps?
We really don't know. There's this voluntary survey that claims that the market is in the range of 50 to 60 or so trillion dollars. It's sort of alarming that in a market that big, we don't even know how big it is to within, say, $10 trillion.
This enabled banks to bet on the direction of a mortgage price. If they guessed right, they would make a bunch of money.
Think of it for a moment as a football game. People in the stands may also have a financial stake in the outcome in the form of a bet with a friend or a bookie.
The new bet that arose over the last several years is a bet based on whether people will default on their mortgages.
And that was the bet that blew up Wall Street.
And crazier still, banks could bet on the outcome of the previous bet, and banks could bet on the bet of that bet. Because these are swaps, and technically not insurance, the banks didn't need any cash to back up their bets if they go bad. What could possibly go wrong?
And it used to be illegal.
It was very illegal 100 years ago because it had brought down the market in 1907. And they said, we're not going to let this happen again. And then 100 years later, in 2000, we rolled them all back.
In retrospect, giving Wall Street immunity from state gambling laws and legalizing activity that had been banned for most of the 20th century should have given lawmakers pause.
If it sounds meaningless, it basically is. These products created no value in the economy, but were making banks a whole bunch of money. Insurance companies, such as AIG, saw their profits soar. Financial engineering was running rampant, and there was no one supervising any of these products. In October 2004, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, bizarrely relaxed the liquidity requirements of 5 banks: Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and Morgan Stanley. This lit the fire.
The more the banks borrowed, the higher their leverage.
The SEC somehow decided to let investment banks gamble a lot more. That was nuts. I don't know why they did that.
From 2004 to 2007, these investment banks each significantly increased their financial leverage. This amplified gains, but also amplified losses. As they gambled more, these banks became extremely vulnerable to financial shocks. In 2007, they reported $4.1 trillion in debt. That was about 30% of US GDP at the time. The stage was now fully set for a moment that would shake the world. During 2004, as the US economy picked up pace, the US central bank started to increase interest rates. This would set off a chain reaction event because financial institutions had offered up many adjustable rate loans based on low rates. Home buyers would enjoy these low rates for about 2 to 3 years. After this period, the rates would reset to align with the market interest rate. But when you combine rising rates with low-income subprime customers, it was a disaster. Home buyers went from paying little to no monthly interest payments to their payments suddenly snapping up to multiple times higher to meet the market. Many just couldn't pay up.
But after 2, 3, or 5 years, those rates reset. They went up, and so did the monthly payment. So a mortgage of, say, $800 a month could easily jump to $1,500.
By mid-2006, an increasing number of defaults caused home prices to fall. Homes were now worth less than their mortgage loans. Many homeowners stopped paying their mortgages and went into foreclosure. This is where the crisis starts gaining momentum. As more foreclosures occurred, home prices fell further, while demand kept decreasing as well. As 2007 got underway, nearly 1.3 million properties were foreclosed. There was a rumbling that something big was going on when the subprime specialist lender, New Century Financial, files for bankruptcy. Then, one subprime lender after another files for bankruptcy. By the end of 2007, 2.3 million homes had been foreclosed, and the subprime mortgage crisis was officially underway. The high default rates by the homeowners led to a rapid devaluation of the financially engineered products from before. Investors were now aware of the risks, and they were now trying to sell these toxic debt boxes at all costs. In March of 2007, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke tries to calm the markets. He states, the subprime loan issue is contained. He couldn't have been more wrong. Ironically, in October 2022, Ben Bernanke won the Nobel Prize for Economics. You're about to see why this is so ironic. In August of 2007, a bombshell announcement rattles the market. France's BNP Paribas announces that there is no liquidity in the global market for mortgage-backed securities. In other words, nobody wants to buy the debt boxes anymore. They're essentially worthless. Other European banks follow with similar announcements. The real picture was becoming clear. The mortgage-backed securities that were supposed to be AAA and safe are in reality worthless. And even worse, they had spread through the global financial system undetected like a cancer. As a result of these shock announcements, there was a panic among financial firms and banks. Investors looked around and wanted to pull any funding that was thought to be vulnerable to mortgage losses. Financial institutions struggled to assess the values of their books. What they thought was worth trillions of dollars could actually be worth close to zero. the contagion continued to spread. September 2007. UK bank Northern Rock was also playing with high leverage and financially engineered products, and they have to be bailed out by the Bank of England. Investors then queued to take their money out. It was the first bank run in the UK since 1866. While all of this was going on, the Federal Reserve was still clueless. They forecasted that the slowdown would be mild, stating that there would still be 3% GDP growth. Come on, guys. March of 2008 sees Bear Stearns fall. Bear Stearns was a pillar of Wall Street, dating back to 1923, and was the 5th largest investment bank. The firm carried a notional market value of $13.4 trillion. So how did this number get so high? This was because they were also being reckless and using very high leverage, which multiplied their losses. Bear Stearns bet big on the mortgage markets and lost.
The markets have certainly gotten worse, but our liquidity position has not changed at all. Our balance sheet has not weakened at all.
And yet, 48 hours later, everything changes. This morning, Schwartz said that the firm's cash position had deteriorated sharply over the past day. Questions now being asked at this loss of $3.5 billion in market value today alone.
They were bought by JP Morgan for $2 a share. Just earlier in the year, Bear Stearns was worth $170 per share.
The item is complete.
Global panic ensued, and it was at a fever pitch. Lehman Brothers, the 4th largest investment bank, is being looked at as the next to fall. It was also heavily exposed to the subprime mortgage financial products. Lehman CFO, Erin Callan, calmed investors by boasting of a profit of $489 million. The stock jumps 48% on the news. But all wasn't as it seems. A later 2010 report by the Court Examiner stated that Lehman executives regularly used accounting gimmicks at the end of each quarter to make their financials seem less shaky than they really were. In reality, their risky commercial real estate holdings were 30 times greater than their capital. Lehman Brothers were so highly leveraged that a 3 to 5% decline in real estate values would completely wipe out all of their capital. By June, Lehman Brothers reported a $2.6 billion loss, which no amount of accounting magic could hide. Their stock falls by 73%. Meanwhile, other banks such as Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs started betting against the mortgage securities, which they were still selling, and they would make hundreds of millions of dollars, while investors lost everything. Unbelievable. At this time, the US had now tipped into recession as GDP fell by 2.1%. September 2008. The crisis begins to spin out of control, and Lehman Brothers collapses. This marks the largest US bankruptcy of all time.
The U.S. government said it won't bail out Lehman, which last week announced more than $3.9 billion in losses. Shares in Lehman Brothers have plummeted more than 80% in 2008 alone.
Everybody in the West, at least, owns, a lot of people have got pensions, and these pensions are invested in the stock market, and a lot of the shares are actually the shares of banks. And when bank shares get hammered, people's pensions get hammered, so everybody loses.
Lehman Brothers is going bankrupt after talks to pull them back from the abyss collapsed. And financial markets from Asia to Europe are doing their utmost to prevent Monday from turning from dark to black.
This is going to be one of the watershed days in financial markets history.
It was a manic Monday in the financial markets. The Dow tumbled more than 500 points after two pillars of the street tumbled over the weekend. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old firm, filed for bankruptcy.
I don't think anyone really expected a bank as big as Lehman to, be in a position that it's in now.
Brought down by bad mortgage investments, Lehman, which has 25,000 employees, will be liquidated.
I'm starting to find another job.
Meanwhile, Merrill Lynch, fearing it could be next, agreed in an act of desperation to a shotgun marriage with Bank of America. So in just 6 months, 3 of the 5 biggest independent firms on Wall Street have now disappeared. Bear Stearns, which collapsed last spring, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson tried to...
The banks were all scared, and they stopped lending to each other, and the financial system froze. Companies couldn't order parts, pay for staff, and businesses ground to a halt. And if nothing was done, planes would have to stop flying.
We came as close as we have ever come in history to a total cardiac arrest, not just of the American economy, but the entire world economy.
Meaning everybody's afraid to lend to everybody else. Credit simply freezes, and an economy, a modern economy, can't function that way?
A modern economy can't function without credit for more than even a couple of hours, frankly, seconds. GE, the pillar of American manufacturing, was having a hard time getting short-term credit. So was Harvard University. Wage bills were not being paid.
Knowing that something had to be done, the infamous bailout started. On September 16, 2008, the US Federal Reserve stepped in to buy AIG, the largest insurer in the US. While Lehman was just another bank, AIG presented a systemic risk to the entire financial system, or so they told us. It was an $85 billion loan, and this was the origin of the famous too big to fail argument.
We're in an urgent situation, and the consequences will grow worse each day if we do not act.
The US government gave the banks $700 billion to purchase toxic assets and bank shares to stop them from falling any lower. It did work, but the biggest banks just ended up being even larger after buying up all the other failing banks. The use of hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to bail out these banks sparked complete outrage. It was the beginning of mass distrust in institutions and governments. The immediate result was the Occupy Wall Street movement and the invention of Bitcoin. Bailing out the banks was an unpopular move. But the other option wasn't fun either. The crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression lasted for almost a decade. There's arguments to be made on both sides. As for now, the crisis was still in full swing. The Federal Reserve also cut interest rates in the hope of restoring the market. In total, during the fourth quarter of 2008, the Central Bank of the United States purchased $2.5 trillion of government debt and junk private assets from the banks. Up until that point, this was the largest monetary policy action in the history of the world. By 2009, the stock market has fallen 50% from its 2007 highs. Pension funds were completely wiped out. As we know, it wasn't just the US that suffered. Institutions and governments around the world owned American assets. In 2008, it became obvious that the crisis was going to have global repercussions. After the fall of Lehman Brothers, banks and corporations globally began to fail. In the UK, HBOS was taken over by Lloyds, and the UK government steps in to save its banking system. With lending markets drying up around the world, the central banks of the United States, European Union, Australia, Canada, and Japan coordinated injecting cash into debt markets for the first time since 9/11. November of 2008 sees the International Monetary Fund approve loans to stabilize Ukraine and Iceland. By December 2008, riots had broken out in Greece.
Much of the day, the clashes were centered around the Greek parliament. A few buildings here being adequately protected.
Iceland was hit particularly bad. Relative to the size of its economy, the systemic collapse was the largest experienced by any country in economic history. Some of the biggest banks in the nation became worthless, and their stock market fell by almost 80%.
Here as elsewhere, the police are first to meet the anger and despair amongst the population. During the past weekends, thousands have taken to the streets to protest against their government and alleged corruption amongst bank managers. For the first time in history in this tiny nation, leading politicians and businessmen are now protected by armed guards. Landsbanki was one of 3 big Icelandic banks that had engaged in an uncontrolled loaning spree abroad. When the international credit crunch hit, they had accumulated loans worth 12 times the nation's GDP. When the banks defaulted, the state had to take over their debts, worth more than $60 billion.
Unlike many countries, the people of Iceland actually chased out their bankers and jailed them. Meanwhile, in the United States, the top 5 Lehman executives walked away with $2 billion, and they got to keep the money. The rest of Europe was still hit hard. the results of which was the European debt crisis, a multi-year economic crisis that took place from 2009 until the end of the 2010s. Some member states, namely Portugal, Greece, Spain, and Ireland, were unable to repay or refinance their government debt. Until today, countries like Greece are still struggling to overcome their financial issues. On April 10, 2009, Time magazine declared, quote, "More quickly than it began, the banking crisis is over." But was it really? Problems still persisted. Wages and incomes continued to languish. The real economy was limping. People would be out of work for a few years to come, and by 2010, unemployment around the world had risen, hitting almost 10% in the United States and Europe. 6 million Americans lost their jobs, and 8 million lost their home.
Oscar Munoz used to sell real estate. Now his company clears out foreclosed homes. I wonder, do you ever come to houses where the people are still here?
Absolutely. That's really a sad situation. I'd rather not meet the people.
Why not?
It's not easy to come in and move a family out. It's just our job to do it for the bank. It's just the nature of what's going on in the market right now.
In 2010, regulatory action was finally taken. The US government passed the Dodd-Frank Act. It included more oversight and transparency for financially engineered products, limits on risky bank investments, tighter regulation for rating agencies. The whole aim was to stop this kind of disaster from ever happening again. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have worked. Today, banks have reinvented the debt boxes and the tools used to speculate on them. This time, they're calling them bespoke collateralized synthetic obligations. This time, they're using corporate debt instead of mortgages. 2022 saw a large spike in activity, quadrupling to $40 billion in this year alone. Let's just hope that corporations don't all default on their debt due to a systemic shock. I personally don't think we'll have another crisis exactly the same as 2008. But safe to say, these stupid financial experiments aren't helping. I really sincerely hope that there's not more of them out there, which we just don't know about.
Hostility research complete. Civilian structure complete.
So what happened next? What scars did such a disaster leave on the economy? Well, there's some strong arguments to be made that there has been no real economy since 2008. If you look at the GDP per capita of the real economy of the United States, it never recovered. It has been below trend since 2008. If you're in your late 30s onwards, this is probably why it felt harder for the average person to get ahead since the crash. In the United States alone, it's projected that an adult that lived through the crash has lost about $70,000 in lifetime earnings. Younger people were less affected, but less employment opportunities still set them back. For the first time, a whole generation would be poorer than their parents. It's not uncommon for younger people to live paycheck to paycheck, funding their lives with buy now, pay later debt. Subsequently, the fertility rates around the world have decreased significantly after 2008. There may be other explanations for the phenomenon, but the charts are clear. A financial disaster would certainly impact the way families would plan for their future. After the 2008 crisis, central banks gained more power. They set interest rates low for so long that the stock market and eventually the whole financial system adjusted and settled around this state. Low interest rates meant cheap money. People, companies, and governments borrowed money with virtually no interest. Investments turned risky, and excessive debt distorted many markets. By the mid-2010s, these conditions had become the scaffolding for the whole financial system. Growth became dependent on central banks keeping these conditions the same. Wealth inequality exploded as those closest to the financial industry got extremely rich, while the rest of the general populace stayed the same. By the late 2010s, many economic commentators were referring to this as the everything bubble. First it was stocks, then it was housing, then it's the debt market now, which controls everything. This next point is key to really understanding the death of the real economy. Economic productivity. This is the measure of how much stuff you get out from the resources that you put in. Since 2008, it's been severely injured. Due to zero interest rates for so long after 2008, the investment that would have gone to productive areas of the economy catapulted into riskier sectors. The real economy just didn't get the capital it needed to innovate and develop and do things more efficiently. Low economic productivity affects real wage growth, living standards, and quality of life. Even former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen called it the, quote, most important factor determining continued advancements in living standards. This is why, when our leaders told us that the economy was booming in the 2010s, it really didn't feel like that to many people. Productivity was gone. It's a missing piece of the 21st century economic story that's often left out. Then we come to 2020, and the pandemic saw central banks respond much quicker with a loss of force, printing trillions of dollars as the economy was slowing to a halt. There's no denying that this mitigated the pain. But was this an overreaction? Many think so. Economic professor Jeremy Siegel called it a monumental mistake. Regardless, the stock market loved it and vaulted to all-time highs. Then, investments into risky assets like NFTs shot up. Eventually, there was too much money in the system and not enough goods, and the prices of everything started to rise. Aside from the fallout of COVID and the war in Ukraine, a component of inflation today comes from the actions of central banks. In the latest stage of this roller coaster, central banks have panicked at the large inflation and have started raising rates. This was to slow down the economy and reduce demand, and this is supposed to bring down inflation. But as stated, low rates and easy money have become the scaffolding of the financial system. Raising interest rates reverses these conditions that the financial system was used to. This is why, as soon as interest rates start rising, everything seems to be falling apart. Stock markets are crashing, and companies are laying off staff. The whole system just isn't used to a normal interest rate environment. Today, there's a lot more debt in the system than in 2008, and this was thanks to central banks keeping interest rates near zero for more than a decade. Increasing rates would make this large volume of debt harder to manage for individuals and governments. Countries like Australia, Canada, and the UK have a lot of variable rate mortgages, which will snap higher to market rates over the next few years. Subprime car loans and credit card loans are seeing increased defaults. Meanwhile, Credit Suisse is in trouble, and they're selling part of their domestic bank. Central bank liquidity swaps are going crazy in Switzerland, doubling in the past couple of weeks. It looks like we're going to have another recession, but what happens beyond that is anyone's guess. After almost 15 years, the 2008 recession has taught us several lessons. It was the loose lending standards and low central bank interest rates that started the problem. Financial engineering spread it to the world. Bad policy, accounting fraud, and poor credit rating agencies fanned the flames. Although structural reform has taken place since 2008, we should also take a deeper look into central banks and their decisions. They always seem to print and leave rates too low for too long, distorting markets and blowing up bubbles, only to pop these bubbles later. It's a scenario that seems to be playing out again today. All in all, the real lesson that we as a society never seem to learn is to keep those in charge accountable and also to plan for the unpredictable. So, for you personally, what can you do if you're worried and don't trust our expert leaders? The key is to avoid risk. If you're inclined to keep your money safe, think about assets that have little to no risk or financial engineering behind them. Some believe physical gold and silver, as boring as they may seem, are the ultimate riskless assets. Others believe government bonds are. Others still think plain old cash is best. Talk to a financial professional to make that personal decision and to sleep easier at night. So before I finally go, I do want to hear some stories from 2008 from you guys. I know I was too young to be impacted directly, but I did know and I got a sense that the world was changing while I was studying in university. So what do you remember from this period? Anyway, a massive thanks for watching. This episode did take a lot of effort to bring to life, so I do want to thank you for sticking till the end. If you did like it, take a look around the channel. There's a lot of interesting stuff on science, technology, business, and finance. In the next episode, we'll move away from finance for a second and take a look at an interesting story. Did you know that apart from Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Apple had a third co-founder, and he sold 10% of his Apple shares for a measly $800 in 1976? Well, I'll see you next time in that episode. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.
We await your command. Shields down! What does the Unity will? Unleash our wrath.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Unleash our wrath. Our will is
August 15th, 1971 will stand as an important event in economic history for many, many generations. In fact, hundreds of years from now, people will look back to that day.
None shall survive. We must act. We are ready. We sensed your presence. Implicitly, divine vengeance. Unleash our wrath. Control group created. This is justice. Production of the item is complete. You may speak.
The sun rises today as it has a million times before. Commuters wake up and travel to their offices to begin the day's work. Farmers tend to their crops. Construction workers build new infrastructure. Today is a day like any other. Or is it? In 2008, the world experienced one of the greatest financial turmoils in history. Markets around the world started crashing, and major financial institutions, once thought to be invincible, started showing signs of collapse. Governments responded quickly, issuing massive bailouts and stimulus packages in an effort to keep the world economy afloat. And it worked. The global economy recovered much quicker than most predicted, and soon it was back to business as usual. And yet, something still isn't quite right. A growing sense of unease fills the population. In the world of finance, indeed, in all facets of modern life, cracks have started to appear.
Hostility research complete.
There's angst out there, and I think if you talk to people on the street today, they would tell you, I don't know what's causing all this, but this just doesn't feel normal to me. The government's running $1 trillion worth of deficit. Why isn't the economy improving? The government's going to spend almost $3.7 trillion. Why don't I have a job? Why is the unemployment rate at 9%? And I even think that number's understated.
A lot of people are feeling unsure about the world today, concerned that something terrible is waiting in the wings. We're told that the global financial crisis of a few years ago has been fixed. But what if the crisis isn't the cause of the angst so many of us feel, but rather the symptom of a much deeper problem?
The item is complete. So shall it be. We must act.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
Our story begins in 1944. With World War II coming to an end, the Allied nations met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to create a new financial system which would stabilize the world once the war ended. With America poised to enter a golden age of prosperity, the U.S. dollar was chosen as the world's reserve currency.
The Bretton Woods system was created after the Second World War at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire. And rather than using gold as the means of exchange between countries, as was the case under the old gold standard, the dollar was going to be used. The dollar was chosen because back then it was as good as gold.
Under this new system, countries agreed to fix their currencies to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar would be tied to gold at a price of $35 per ounce. This meant that countries around the world could trade their currencies for U.S. dollars, which they could then exchange for gold. This created a system where all currencies were essentially backed by gold. To avoid the logistics of shipping physical gold across the world, when countries did exchange their currencies for gold, it was usually stored safely in the U.S.
Under the Bretton Woods system, you could exchange your currency or your dollars for gold. Now, it only applied to foreign countries and central banks. And we began to run budget deficits. We were running the Great Society program under Lyndon Johnson, and we were fighting a war in Vietnam. And all of a sudden, we were running these deficits, and countries were changing their dollars, and they said they wanted gold. And it began with the French, and then it started to spread.
With all the new spending programs in the United States, other countries became concerned that the U.S. was spending more money than it had gold reserves. They started exchanging their dollars for gold and demanded physical delivery, as they felt that there were more dollars being printed than the gold that backed it. To prevent this outflow of gold from American vaults, President Nixon called for an emergency suspension of the gold convertibility system.
Control group created.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
All of the problems that we see today in the monetary system are a direct result of the decision made in August 15th, 1971, to abandon a fixed link back to gold. What gold did is it provided discipline on governments, provided discipline on government spending.
Under the old system, if you ran a budget deficit, then what would happen is gold would flow out of your country until there was a balance again. Well, without any gold backing, then countries ran perpetual deficits. So if you look at, for example, this country, from 1971 on, the U.S. has never run a surplus. Ever since we went off the gold standard, it's just been perpetual stimulus. Good times, bad times, always run a deficit.
What led Nixon to abandon the gold standard in 1971, although he claimed it was temporary, we've been waiting 40 years, we're still off of it. We ran up huge deficits during the 1960s. We had the guns and butter economy where the government was both simultaneously fighting a war in Vietnam abroad. In addition, we were funding manned missions to the moon and the whole space program. We were creating more money than we had gold reserves to back it up. And a lot of our foreign creditors saw this and began to demand gold rather than their Federal Reserve notes, because they sensed that Washington simply didn't have enough gold to make its commitment to back the dollar.
By removing the link between gold and the U.S. dollar, President Nixon created a system where all currencies were backed by nothing. This is what is known as a fiat currency.
Fiat currency is currency that's backed by nothing except government promises. The word fiat is a Latin word, and it basically means currency that's circulating by force. If people have confidence in that currency, and if there's enough government force, that will enable the currency to circulate for a period of time until people lose confidence in the currency.
There is no nation on this planet that currently uses money. We all use currency. There will come a day when everybody knows the difference.
Money is a medium of exchange, and the way it has evolved is that it's always something of intrinsic value until the modern age, when the politicians say, well, we don't need anything of intrinsic value anymore. All we need is political decree. We can say this is money, this piece of paper is money. Now money has a new characteristic. But underneath it all, there's this same concept in place that nobody ever seems to challenge, and that is that governments have a right to declare something of no value to be money, and you must accept it. That's really the problem, and it's still the problem today. It's destroying the economies of the world.
With currencies no longer backed by anything real or tangible, their value was measured only in relation to each other. And because countries with relatively weak currencies could make products cheaply, countries devalue their own currencies to make them desirable trading partners.
Every paper currency measures itself against the dollar. So if the dollar goes down, the other central banks respond to that, and they try and intervene in the foreign exchange markets to ensure that the impact doesn't hit their domestic economies.
What is a Ponzi scheme? A Ponzi scheme is a fraudulent investment scheme that promises high returns for investors with little or no risk. Sounds too good to be true, right? That's because it is. In a legitimate investment scheme, the money invested is used to build wealth, typically through low-risk ventures like stock or real estate portfolios. Over time, this generates enough income to pay the investor back their initial investment plus some profit. A Ponzi scheme, on the other hand, promises massive returns quickly. How does it accomplish this? Instead of using the money invested to build wealth, a Ponzi scheme simply brings in more investors to pay off the previous investors. And because these new investors have also been promised large returns, the scheme must then find an even bigger group of investors to pay them off. All the while, the creators of the scheme are skimming cash from each group of investors. Because a Ponzi scheme doesn't generate any wealth itself, it must constantly bring in larger and larger groups of investors to keep functioning. Eventually, no more new investors can be found, or large numbers of previous investors all cash out at the same time, and the scheme collapses in on itself. By this time, the perpetrators of the scheme have siphoned off tremendous amounts of money for themselves, while the investors are left out of pocket and out of luck.
Without a fixed link to gold, the U.S. Treasury has been able to borrow and spend as much money as it wanted. When the U.S. government needs money, it takes out a loan with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve prints the currency required for the loan, and in return receives an IOU from the U.S. Treasury. These IOUs are called government bonds. With the money provided from these loans, or bonds, the U.S. government pays its bills and obligations. Meanwhile, the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve work closely together to sell these bonds at auction, where foreign central banks, pension funds, and even individuals buy these U.S. government loans. And why wouldn't they? Loaning money to the U.S. government is virtually a risk-free investment. But if the loans are spent on bills and paying off previous loans, where does the government get the money to pay back the current loan and the interest that is charged on it? Is investing in a U.S. government bond simply one small part in a giant Ponzi scheme?
The Federal Reserve System is definitely a Ponzi scheme. There's no question about it. They go through the appearance of lending money to the governments, and the governments agree to pay back the money plus interest. And so this money comes into being. They create it just for that purpose. They give it to the governments. Didn't exist before that, you understand. Central banks just make it out of nothing and click a few keys on a keyboard of a computer, and the Treasury of the United States government now has another $1 trillion that it can spend. That's where that money came from. And so that creates a liability on the part of the federal government to pay it back, plus interest. Now think about that, plus interest. Well, when it comes time to pay it back, plus the interest, they can't pay it back, and they certainly can't pay it back plus interest too. So what they do is they borrow more to cover the original loan plus the interest, and then by that time Congress wants more money anyway. So the debt just keeps going up and up and up and up.
Under the current monetary system, we borrow all of our currency into existence, and we promise to pay it back plus interest. If you borrow the very first dollar into existence, and that's the only dollar that exists on the planet, but you promise to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest, where do you get the second dollar? The answer is you have to borrow that. It's a Ponzi scheme because you can never pay it off. It always requires that we go deeper into debt.
Since 1971, the United States has been running trade deficits with the rest of the world, meaning we've been buying a lot more products from the rest of the world than they have been buying from us. The Japanese and Koreans sell us cars and electronics. The Middle East sells us oil. And the Chinese sell us seemingly everything on our Walmart shelves. The U.S. pays for these products with U.S. dollars, and everyone is happy. But if countries were to convert these U.S. dollar profits back into their own currencies, their currencies would rise in value, making their economies less desirable to trade with. Instead, countries invest their dollar profits by buying U.S. government bonds. So countries around the world sell their goods to the U.S. in exchange for U.S. dollars, which have been borrowed through the Federal Reserve, creating IOUs. And countries then loan their U.S. dollar profits back to the U.S. by buying more IOUs. The money from these loans is spent on paying government expenses, as well as paying back previous IOUs. But in order to do this, larger and larger loans must be made in order to pay back the principal and the interest. By paying back old loans with new and larger loans, it would appear as if the entire world has been investing their hard-earned money into a Ponzi scheme of epic proportions.
In this business of creating money for federal governments and national governments around the world, if they didn't keep creating new money in larger and larger amounts, the whole thing would crash, because that's where the money comes from to pay off the previous loans. It's the new loans. So that's why it's a Ponzi scheme. It's a classic Ponzi scheme.
In order for the U.S. economy to function, we have to borrow more and more money from the rest of the world. And the more money they loan us today, the more money they have to loan us in the future. And if they ever stop loaning, the whole thing collapses and we can't pay them back.
Every Friday night, Julia's job is to compare the grocery prices of our neighborhood stores for Saturday morning shopping. There are 5 big neighborhood markets within a couple of blocks of our house, and Julia spreads her shopping around, going where the prices are lowest and the quality best.
Remember when a chocolate bar cost $0.25? When you could fill your car up for $5 and feed a family of 6 for $35 a week? Whatever happened to those days? Without anything tangible backing currencies, governments could borrow and print as much currency as it wanted. This has gradually led to the value of our currency being eroded.
With the creation of all this money, that dilutes the value of all of the dollars that were out there before, so that the purchasing power of the dollar gets crowded down, and we used to be able to buy a gallon of gas for 31 cents. Now it's hitting around $5.
The average guy in the street is affected by inflation because of the loss of purchasing power. And as a consequence, his standard of living is declining if he can't keep up with the inflation rate.
In many measures of a standard of living, Americans today are actually worse off. You can take my grandparents. My grandmother never worked, despite the fact that my grandfather was a carpenter. And they had 8 children. Could a carpenter, somebody without even a high school diploma, just working in a blue-collar job, support a wife and 8 kids today? Oh, it's not a chance.
With inflation rising faster than incomes, people were forced into more and more drastic measures to maintain their standard of living.
With each new day, the work of a family begins again.
When we went off gold backing of the dollar, what used to happen prior to that is the husband went to work, the wife stayed at home, raised the family. Because of inflation in the 70s, the wife went to work. So now you had 2 incomes that were necessary to produce and buy the same goods and services. In the 90s, we stopped saving. The savings rate basically got down to zero because people were spending. They couldn't save in order to buy the same goods and services. Then we got to the last decade. The wife was already working. The savings were down to zero. They borrowed money. And so we've gone from 2 earners getting rid of our savings rate to borrowing money to keep pace with inflation.
The average person is now forced to borrow well beyond their means, getting themselves deeply into debt. At first, this was to maintain a nice standard of living, but slowly, it has become necessary just to survive. By printing so much currency and devaluing it so heavily, it would seem that governments are essentially levying a hidden tax on their people.
Central banks try to say that 2% or 3% inflation is a good thing, and they make that a target. Well, it's still a tax. Why is 2% inflation or 3% inflation better for the country than no inflation? You'll be told, of course, that it's better than deflation, and you'll be told that people like to feel that their money or their jobs or their wages are going up by 2%, at least it's something. Where in fact, that 2% is robbery, and what they get is going down by that amount.
We are experiencing inflation these days. I mean, yeah, they say the CPI is up whatever it is, 2 or 3%. I mean, anybody who's alive knows that inflation is well beyond that, probably running double digits.
The purchasing power of the average person has been deteriorating drastically. But in order to disguise this, governments have been skewing the figures in their reports to make it seem as if inflation is much lower than it really is.
There is this curious distinction made, which most people don't understand, between core inflation and headline inflation. The core inflation is the sort of basic 2% target, which doesn't matter, and the headline inflation is once you include all such of things like energy prices and sudden tax rises and the rest.
Well, the inflation rate is skewed. They use all kinds of contrivances to make the inflation rate look lower than what it really is. If the U.S. government were using the same CPI model that they did when President Carter was in the White House in the late 1970s, the inflation rate today in the United States would be 9 or 10%. That's how badly the currency is being debased. Now, the reason why they do that is there are a lot of inflation-adjusted responsibilities that the U.S. government has to pay out money to, for example, people on the Social Security system on an inflation-adjusted basis. If they keep the inflation rate low, according to their own statistic, that means they're paying out less. That means the government budget deficit is less.
A thriving metropolis, Toledo is one of the world's greatest glass processing centers. In Akron, the state's 5th largest city, that story deals primarily with rubber. Akron is the rubber manufacturing capital of the nation and the world. Her very name is synonymous with rubber.
In a global economy where currencies are measured only against each other, countries are able to artificially lower the value of their own currency, making their industries more competitive. A country with a weak currency can make products cheaper, causing entire industrial centers to move overseas. This effect has been seen countless times in cities around the world, some of which still haven't recovered from the loss of their industrial base.
I think the guy on the street he's kind of frustrated. They go, gosh, I went to college, I don't have a job, I can't get a job, I spent all this money, I've got student loans, it's costing me more to live. The Fed is telling me there's no inflation, yet I go to the store and I see the price of milk going up, eggs, meat. I pull into a gas station, it's costing me more for gas. They don't really understand how all this affects them on a personal level. And that's why I think they're frustrated, because there isn't an educational system that explains that, look, when you print money, when you have nothing backing it, and when you debase it, you have all the side effects that you see. Higher inflation costs, corruption, cronyism, all the things that have been in headlines that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years.
The protest movements are an interesting phenomenon. A lot of people are terribly upset with Wall Street. They're upset what's happening to their purchasing power. They're upset With the news that they hear of the fact that the executives of these giant banks are getting million-dollar bonuses at the same time they're dipping into the pockets of the taxpayers to get all this bailout money, and so they're angry. Unfortunately, people are demonstrating against the crisis, the economic crisis, and yet at the same time they're demanding more welfare, demanding more medical benefits, they're demanding more state control and regulation of their lives, they're demanding more money being created and pumped into the society. They don't realize that those are the very things that have brought them onto the street in the first place in their anger.
While the person on the street is struggling to get by, we're told that what we're experiencing is a typical recession. Why then does this current crisis feel different to previous economic recessions?
This is far from typical. I think this is the end game. I think what we're experiencing now are the pains of the 40-year experiment in fiat currency coming to an end, and it is an absolute failure, not only for America, but for the entire world.
Up until 2008, we've been borrowing more and more money to maintain our standard of living. Are we now at the point where we're maxed out and cannot take on any more new debt?
What we're seeing today is deleveraging at all levels of society. I mean, consumers are maxed out. Each succession that we had in the economy, when we went through this boom and bust period, we'd go through a bust, they would reinflate again, the economy would start up again, but we kept piling on levels of debt. And finally, we reached the point where you just can't pile any more debt.
Banks are no longer willing to give out credit so freely, and many people are more concerned with paying off existing debt as opposed to taking on new debt. While this is prudent, sensible behavior, it's also a serious threat to the global economy. Having set itself up as a giant Ponzi scheme, the global economy is reliant on more and larger debt being issued to keep itself functioning.
If you try to just live within your means and get by with just the amount of dollars that we have today, paying the interest on them collapses the currency supply. And so we continually have to borrow more units of currency into existence every month than we extinguish by paying off debt.
The system, as it's been presently structured, is that they have to continue expanding the money supply, otherwise the system is going to die.
Politicians and pundits talk about living within our means and paying down the debt. You can't do that without collapsing the entire economy. It would just vanish into this black hole.
All the politicians are in a situation where if they don't come to the rescue, we could just have an overnight shutdown, which they can't ever imagine happening while they're in power. So there's always this wish to move it on and, kick, as you know, the expression, kick the can down the road, which is really what we're doing.
But the problem is we've run out of road. You know, there is no place to kick the can anymore. We've got to deal with the can, and it's not simply a can, because every time we kicked it down the road, unfortunately, it got bigger. So now it's an enormous can, and you know, it's going to crush us.
While the financial crisis of 2008 may have been the first death throes of the Ponzi scheme, governments around the world weren't about to sit back and let it fail. So they delayed the inevitable collapse, pushing it down the road by bailing out struggling financial institutions, buying toxic mortgages, and taking on debt on behalf of its citizens.
You've made a wise acquisition.
In 2009 and 2010, what happened was the crisis was papered over through bailouts, guarantees, money printing, expansion of the money supply, et cetera. And governments can do that. I mean, don't underestimate the ability of governments to dictate results in the short run. But in the long run, none of the problems were solved. The bad debts are still there. The banks are still insolvent. The banks are not lending. The economy's not growing. So we haven't really solved anything.
By buying their way out of these crises, by creating money out of nothing and flooding it into the economy and diluting the purchasing power, they're not really solving the problem. What they're doing is pushing it off a little bit into the future and making it worse.
Now, do we keep going down this road? Do we print more money? I mean, the Fed balance sheet went from $800 billion to $3 trillion. Should it now go to $6 trillion? We had a $800 billion stimulus. Should we now have a $2 trillion stimulus? I mean, in theory, you could, but this is where people could lose faith entirely in the currency, and the currency could collapse.
The Federal Reserve's money printing exercises may help prop up the economy in the short term, but what are the consequences of money printing on such a large scale?
Any last words?
I think you're going to see a very rapid decline in the value of the dollar in a matter of days, whether it's 20%, 30%, 40%. A lot of people have been buying the dollar as a safe haven. You know, when they find out that there's no safety there, in fact, they need a safe haven from the dollar. I mean, right now the dollar is benefiting from the fear trade. Well, what if the fear trade is afraid of the dollar?
Aside from causing an enormous amount of inflation, the Federal Reserve's reckless money printing exercises also run the very real risk of creating a worldwide loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar.
I think a currency crisis is highly likely, but it'll be very difficult to know exactly what will cause it and when. I think it'll be something unforeseen. It could be a natural disaster, it could be a political shock, it could be just a general loss of confidence.
It could be something as simple as a treasury auction that goes bad, there's no buyers, and all of a sudden the interest rate starts to go up. Then the financial players, the big hedge funds, start to react to it, dumping dollars. Then all of a sudden you have foreign central banks that begin dumping dollars, get me out. And when that happens, just like that.
At some point, just like all Ponzi schemes, the participants wake up to the con, they don't want to participate anymore, and the whole thing implodes. Now, you know, when private factors, when people who are voluntarily participating, foreigners, foreign central banks, when they stop buying, the one difference is the Federal Reserve can come and supply the demand for the people who are waking up to the Ponzi nature of what we're doing. But of course, when the Fed becomes the only buyer, that's the end game, or be the beginning of the hyperinflation.
Hyperinflation is a rapid increase in the inflation rate, so much so that people lose faith in the currency, and you see what is in fact a flight from the currency.
Defeated Germany has a runaway inflation. In Germany, the mark becomes so worthless, it is used to paper walls or to light stoves.
What happens is the government spends so much money, forcing it to borrow. It gets to the stage where it's borrowing more money than the market is willing to lend to it. The central bank then steps in and turns that government debt into currency.
The great question is, and I don't know the answer, is at what level of inflation, 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, do you start to panic? All I know is when that level comes, everybody panics together.
Consequence of a hyperinflation is the price of goods and services rises very, very rapidly, and that feeds upon itself, causing people to get rid of the currency even more quickly.
So you then have a situation where people go out and they buy things just to get the hell out of paper money. And paradoxically, that then starts driving and accelerating demand for paper money, because they want more paper money to go and buy things. So you have this situation where the value of paper money starts collapsing in advance of its issue.
In everyday life, you'll be scrambling from day to day to get tangible things. If you're thinking of buying one can of tuna, you're going to buy two, because you know that tomorrow or even later on that day or the next hour, that can of tuna is going to be costing you more. That you're going to be scrambling to get anything that's tangible.
This period is going to involve a lot of economic pain. A lot of people who are currently retired in America are going to have to get jobs. Their retirement is gone. It's been bankrupted because they put their faith in a Bernie Madoff type national Ponzi scheme. And of course, a lot of the property is going to decay if people are spending money on these necessities. They don't have money to make the repairs necessary to maintain their properties. If the landlords can't collect rents from their tenants, how are they going to maintain the properties? How are they going to pay the taxes? So I think the whole economy is going to crumble beneath the weight of this runaway inflation. And of course, the initial reaction by the Fed will be to create even more inflation, to try to stimulate the economy by printing even more money, which of course is the source of the problem.
On the surface, it would appear that this is a problem facing the United States alone. But with so many countries holding their savings in U.S. government bonds, a loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar could trigger a global crisis, which would affect every nation on Earth.
If the U.S. dollar hyperinflates, the implications are really profound, because you can go to a country like Zimbabwe and see the impact of a hyperinflation. But what happens when the world's reserve currency hyperinflates? We've never been in this situation before. It's impossible to predict, what the outcome is going to be. But logic suggests that if the U.S. dollar hyperinflates, most, if not all, of the currencies of the world will also have severe economic problems, because at the end of the day, the reserves of all of these currencies are basically dollars. There have been dozens and dozens of currency collapses since the end of the Second World War, and they all result from the same thing, bad policies, bad management. And the U.S. right now is pursuing bad policies. Central bank is doing a bad job managing the currency. And as a consequence, it's inevitable that the dollar is going to collapse. It's on this road that I call the fiat currency graveyard.
The markets, the private sector, however you like to decide it, people, they suddenly sort of move in a herd instinct. They suddenly sort of understand things. And this can happen overnight. I mean, it really can. So the timing of this is, I think, very difficult, if anything, impossible for us to say. But I would point out that there is the danger that, I use a metaphor, one morning we will wake up and find that we are in a very different world. It may not be one morning, it may be a week, a month, I don't know. But when it happens, I think it'll happen quite quickly. And we won't really be able to predict when.
Hyperinflation may be one of several scenarios facing the world today. But history has shown us that whenever a nation tried to run its economy using an artificial fiat system, the end result is always the same: disaster.
There is a proven 100% failure rate. There is no exception to this. Fiat currencies always fail. And then 40 years ago, we tried this grand experiment where all the world's currencies became fiat at the same time, when we ended the Bretton Woods system.
The world is going to have to extricate itself from this monetary system based on the dollar, because if you want to back your currency, you have to back it with something. You can't back it with nothing. I always think of that old Superman movie where the first one where Lois Lane, she falls off the top of the building, and Superman catches her. And he says, "I got you. Don't worry, I got you." And she says, "Well, you got me. Who's got you?" Well, that's the dollar. Who's got the dollar? It's not Superman. The dollar can't fly on its own. The dollar used to be backed by gold. It was gold that had the dollar. It's like everybody has tethered their ships to the Titanic of currencies. And so we're all going to go down.
If there is a loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar, and I think there will be in this decade, it's happened before, it'll just be history repeating, then we'll probably have to go back to something that will instill confidence. And what instills confidence is gold.
The only real solution is to go back to a real sound currency, real money with something behind it. It doesn't have to be gold or silver, but historically that has always been what societies have chosen through trial and error. They've tried this, they've tried that. They always wind up with gold or silver. I think that probably is a clue that it's not a bad way to go.
With all the uncertainty facing the world today, a return to a gold-backed economy would seem logical. So how come there isn't so much as a discussion about such a return? The answer is as simple as it is alarming. The people at the top, the ones who have been benefiting from the current Ponzi system, don't want the ride to end. Many now believe the price of gold and silver have been artificially suppressed to make it seem less desirable as a unit of global exchange.
What governments try to do is to maintain a low gold price, because by doing that, it makes the dollar look worthy of being the world's reserve currency, when in fact we know the dollar is not worthy of that esteemed position because it's being so badly mismanaged by the United States.
Groups like the Gold Anti-Trust Action Committee, or GATA, have been tracking what they believe is the deliberate suppression of gold and silver prices through a variety of dubious means.
In 12 years, we've amassed nothing but evidence that supports the manipulation of the gold price. It'd be like talking about a murder trial when the jury would say guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but you've got to present each point of evidence and how it all fits together.
There are numerous methods that they use to suppress the price of gold. Some are harder to prove than others, but some of them are fully reported, and that's central bank sales.
Between 1999 and 2002, the Bank of England foolishly sold a massive amount of Britain's gold reserves at an average price of $275 an ounce. The proceeds were spent buying euros and US dollars. The governments of Canada, France, and Switzerland, among others, were also sellers of their gold around this time.
We know that the central banks used to sell 400 tons every year. Well, why were they selling 400 tons? Obviously, it was the dumbest decision anyone could have made in the decade. By far the dumbest. But they did it every year, sell 400, sell 400. I mean, now, gold goes from 300 to 1,600, almost 1,700. Why were you selling the gold? Because they were trying to keep the price down. So it was a coordinated thing to keep everyone focused on believing in currencies.
Alan Greenspan, in testimony to Congress, admitted that they were manipulating the price of gold when he said, "The world's central banks stand ready to lease gold in increasing quantities," meaning they were already doing it. Should the price of gold rise, meaning the target was to suppress the price of gold. So they were already doing it, and their target was to suppress the price of gold. He admitted it in testimony to Congress.
Although central banks are able to sell off their country's gold holdings legally, they may have also been suppressing the price of gold using some other rather questionable means. Some investigators believe that Western central banks have been loaning their country's gold to bullion banks. A bullion bank is an institution that sells gold with the intention of buying it back sometime in the future at a cheaper price. With the proceeds of this sale, these banks have been known to buy U.S. government bonds. While this isn't a problem in itself, central banks report the gold they have and the gold they've loaned to these bullion banks as one item. So while a central bank may claim it has a certain amount of gold in reserves, much of that gold may be on loan to a bullion bank, which may have sold the gold in exchange for government bonds.
One means of intervention in the gold market is the lending of gold to so-called bullion banks, and they sell it in the market. This suppresses the price as if the central banks would sell it directly, but this lending does not appear in the book of the central banks.
The U.S. Treasury a few years ago changed the way they account for gold, and they're accounting for some of their receivables and their inventory as one line item. So they're accounting for what they actually have and what people owe them as the same thing. And that is basically illegal accounting. It's fraudulent.
But why work so hard to keep the price of gold and silver low? Why do healthy gold and silver prices threaten to collapse the Ponzi scheme?
There's this competitive relationship between gold and national currencies because gold is the only competitor to a national currency. Gold is money, and these national currencies are money substitutes that circulate in place of gold.
Fiat money gives the power to government. Real money keeps the power with the people. Because when you have real money, government is limited. It can only spend what it taxes. And the public will resist taxation. But if the government can simply print and borrow, there's a lot less resistance. And so it's a lot easier for the government to grow when it can promise something for nothing. And so that's what they do. And so gold is what protects the people from the reckless policies of government. Gold is government chaperone. The government wants to be able to do whatever it wants. Gold stands in its way. So yes, gold is an enemy of big government, but it's a friend of freedom. It's a protector of individuals from government.
Gold's a competitor to the dollar. When it's going way up, it's a threat for inflation. It's a barometer of the well-being of the United States. Look at gold screaming now and the world's falling apart. So it calls attention to how bad things are. So the U.S. government has an interest, Wall Street, the politicians, to keep the price suppressed.
Wall Street doesn't want you going down to a coin dealer buying gold and silver coins. They want to sell you paper. The government wants to sell you paper, so I would say it's the government and Wall Street.
Gold in the hands of people is the way you control government. Governments cannot create money out of thin air. If it's gold, they can only create paper out of thin air. And if they can create paper out of thin air, they can use that paper to wage wars, or they can use that paper as a political contrivance to enrich their friends. And as a consequence, governments have been fighting gold all century long.
Despite this desire to keep gold and silver down, the recent instability in the markets has seen the demand for gold and silver skyrocket. This, in turn, has exposed a deeper problem within the central banks.
The problem the central banks in the West now face is that they have sold an awful lot of gold to try and suppress the price of gold. They are now embarrassed by the fact that central banks, not in that original cartel, are now really very keen buyers of gold. And we're talking about the Chinese, we're talking about the Russians, we're talking about the Indians, we're talking about even Mexico. All these non-mainstream central banks, not part of, if you like, the top club members of the Bank of International Settlements, you know, the little guys in that context, they're picking up hundreds of tons of this stuff.
To suppress the price of gold, Western central banks have had to sell or loan out their country's gold holdings. But because the gold they sell rarely leaves their vaults, no one can be certain they aren't selling or loaning out more gold than they physically own. If this is true, then this could be one of the biggest scams ever perpetrated in history. A massive con perpetrated not by individuals, but by entire governments.
This central bank gold, most of it sits at the New York Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. So it's in the basement of these two places, and it doesn't actually move. When a country is doing international settlement, they basically take a bar off of this pile and put it on that pile. Or they'll just change the labels, or it's just a book entry, it's accounting. Except there's been some pretty creative accounting on all this gold, and I doubt very much that I don't think all of it is there.
The question remains, if everybody, especially the big players, wanted all their gold delivered at the same time, it is physically impossible to do it.
Most gold that exists on the planet, there's more than one claim on each ounce of gold. There's several people that think that they have title to that same ounce of gold. I have said many, many, many times, over and over again, if you can't hold it, you don't own it.
The game can't go on forever because sooner or later people are going to demand their physical gold or silver, and that already is happening.
The lack of accountability in gold sales by Western central banks hasn't been a concern so far. But as more and more buyers of gold have started to demand physical delivery, central banks that have oversold or loaned out their country's gold will find themselves caught in a major scandal. The result of such fraudulent activity means buyers of gold, be they individuals, pension or hedge funds, or even entire nations, could be ripped off for billions of dollars.
It's a little similar than the Murdoch scandal here at Fox News in London, the Madoff scandal. I mean, it's a very incestuous relationship between press, big money, and the politicians. And unfortunately, these things don't get corrected until they blow up. Madoff blew up. Murdoch blew up. The gold market is going to blow up, and I think will be a bigger scandal than either of them because it's a worldwide financial situation.
Item complete. New modules.
The only trick that the politicians in power today know, and the central bankers, the only trick they know is to create more money out of nothing, to inflate the currency. They have no other trick. So as long as we keep looking to them to be our leaders and solve the problem, how can we expect anything else? That's the only trick they know. Because the only trick other trick there is to stop inflating and to go back to a sound currency. And that would say, they'd say, oh no, we can't do that. And the reason they can't do that is because it would put them all out of business. They wouldn't be able to continue the Ponzi scheme.
Even with cracks forming in the current financial system, the only solutions offered by governments are in fact just more steps down the road to disaster. But while a single person may not be able to save the world, there is still something you can do to protect your family and yourself.
It is destined.
You cannot turn to a Ponzi schemer and ask him to run a real business, because he doesn't know how. So you can't turn to all of these Ponzi schemers in government who are inflating the currency and say, well, let's solve the crisis in some other way. They don't know how. So the solution is to quit depending on the same people with the same mentality to solve our problems.
If governments won't go back on a gold standard, individuals can go back on the gold standard all by themselves. Politicians can create fiat money at will. That's why it's fiat. So why would you want to put your faith in that? Put your trust in politicians and bureaucrats and central bankers when you could just have something real that has intrinsic value, that is scarce, and that is going to remain scarce.
Would you rather have gold or a fiat currency? And we see what's happening in the world, and obviously people are starting to figure out that gold was likely to sustain its value way more than a piece of paper is.
It's not that the price of gold is going up, it's that the value of the dollar is going down. The price remains constant in terms of human effort and purchasing power. An ounce of gold today will buy the same thing it bought 2,000 years ago. An ounce of gold today is approximately takes so much human effort to get out and refine the same human effort that it took to do certain things 2,000 years ago. It's the human effort equation that maintains stability. How much effort does it take?
Gold is financial insurance. And the thing about it is you own it because you want to be protected. And, you know, you just have to have it if you want to have or sleep at night, because there's nothing else. You know, if some catastrophic event happens, and we've seen them, how are you going to be protected?
The current financial system may be dying, but where there is chaos, there is also opportunity. As the old model falls apart, the door may be opened for great prosperity.
It's clearly not the end of the world. I mean, it's probably not even the end of America. For many countries, this is going to be the beginning of an economic boom, a giant burden being lifting off their shoulders, where the world no longer has to loan trillions of dollars to Americans so that we can continue to consume what we don't produce. When this comes to an end, the world will benefit. So it is not something that we should fear. We should embrace it as a world.
This is the greatest wealth transfer in history. If we have a global currency crisis, then you're going to see a greater wealth transfer than has ever happened in all of history. It's all going to happen at once. Therefore, it's the greatest opportunity.
We have millions of people now taking an interest in what is money, the question of what is money, what should it be? And they're learning, especially a lot of young people.
The sun will rise tomorrow, as it has a million times before. Commuters will wake up and travel to their offices to begin the day's work. Farmers will tend to their crops, and construction workers will build new infrastructure. But will the world they live in still be the same? In 2008, the world was given a wake-up call. The biggest financial crash in human history was delayed by the same poor decisions that brought it about in the first place. What that massive bailout bought us was not a solution, but merely time. Time for the people responsible to wring the last few dollars out of a dying system. But also, for those able to see the cliff edge approaching, time to protect themselves and their families from the imminent plunge. And in the end, that time may prove to be the most valuable commodity of all.
There are these brief moments in history where the safe haven asset for the last 5,000 years simultaneously becomes the asset class that has the greatest single potential gains in purchasing power. We're in one of these cycles right now where money is the best investment. Get out of currency, buy money, and you're probably going to be able to buy a whole lot more stuff later. But the best thing that people can do of all is really to take on their own responsibility for getting financially educated. This is the most important thing. Don't let the banks and the brokerage houses and other people guide all of your decisions. Find out what's going on for yourself. Empower yourself.
Your command. We are ready.
Mining upgrade complete.
The anima are restless.
We obey the Unity's will.
Planet item ready.
The Unity calls us to action.
Civilian structure complete.
The enemy will know our wrath.
The item is complete.
We obey the Unity's will. We shall do as you command. The Unity calls us to action.
We are entertaining
the British soldier.
The anima are restless.
All around the globe you'll find it, from Gibraltar to Hong Kong. Everywhere he stands against the threatening years, staunch symbol of our common will to order.
We seek minds to make our own. Their worlds will burn in the Unity's flames. They will join us or die. We shall do as you command.
Your presence is strong.
Desecrators assault our world.
We await the Unity's command.
The British
The
Empire,
are restless.
the largest empire the world has ever known. For over 300 years, Britain ruled, its armies conquered, and its bankers proclaimed the might of its currency. But one day, it all began to fall apart. One by one, countries declared their independence from Britain, and no amount of force could reverse the tide. As British elites saw their wealth, privileges, and empire disintegrate, they began to search for a new role in a changing world, and they found one in finance. This is a film about how Britain transformed from a colonial power to a modern financial power, and how this transformation has shaped the world we live in.
Anima are restless.
Shields are compromised.
Our will shall be done. is complete.
In the days of the British Empire, the City of London was the world's biggest global financial centre.
The City of London was the kind of beating financial heart of the British Empire. The historians Kane and Hopkins called it the governor of the imperial engine. All these countries in the empire used to use the sterling currency, and the City of London was kind of the financier of this zone, not just inside the sterling zone, but outside the sterling zone as well.
As Britain's empire declined, so too did the City of London.
One British army truck is bombed, killing 2 soldiers and wounding 12. As rioting becomes daily more widespread on Cyprus, young people of high school age take an increasing part in the violence. Here, a group of girls are being dispersed after a rock-throwing battle with British military police.
With the decline of empire, British commercial interests across the globe were under threat. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal.
A new Middle East crisis arises as President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal.
The item is complete.
France and Britain issue a 12-hour ultimatum. Within hours of its expiration, Britain's warplanes are winging their way to Egypt, and its bombers attack 5 key cities, including Cairo.
The United States was opposed to the invasion and put pressure on Britain and France to withdraw their troops.
There will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. It is our hope and intent this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem.
Britain was humiliated. The Suez Crisis signified the end of Britain's role as one of the world's major powers.
Following the crisis, there was a run on the sterling, on the UK pound. Some people suspect that the American government was encouraging this run on the UK pound.
As financiers withdrew their money from Britain, the value of the pound decreased. To protect the value of the pound, Britain limited the bank's overseas lending.
They were not able to invest abroad, and obviously they were unhappy. And we don't know exactly the context, but it's very clear that the banks or their representative made a representation to the Bank of England, which in itself was dominated by representative from the banking industry. It seems that they have reached an agreement which was never written, that if the banks intermediated between 2 non-residents in a foreign currency, in that case the dollar, then this particular intermediation, this particular deal will not be considered by the Bank of England under its own jurisdiction.
The banks began to create a market for dollars in London, called the London Eurodollar market. To differentiate these euro market activities from their domestic banking activities, banks kept 2 sets of accounts.
We are ready.
The Bank of England, the UK regulator, declared that the London Euro market accounts were not in London. They were elsewhere, and therefore it had no responsibility for regulating them.
It's about providing a legal space in which you pretend activity is taking place. And the importance of that is that you pretend it's not taking place in the economy where it really is taking place. So you're taking activity from the place where it's regulated and taxed and pretending that it's happening elsewhere. Now where doesn't really matter, it's just elsewhere.
When American banks realized that London offered the ability to avoid US regulations, they moved their international operations to the city. Around the same time as American banks were moving their international operations to London, another new kind of financial space began to emerge, far away from London, in Britain's overseas jurisdictions, the last remnants of empire.
Back in the 60s, the Cayman Islands was a complete backwater. The stories go that mosquitoes were so thick in the air sometimes they were enough to suffocate cows. That's a legend that you hear about the Cayman Islands. I don't know how true it was, but there was nothing happening there.
Accountants and lawyers from London arrived in the Cayman Islands and other British dependencies and began to draft a set of financial secrecy laws and regulations. Because these jurisdictions' main selling point was secrecy, they were called secrecy jurisdictions.
What the Cayman Islands was doing was straightforwardly illegal activity. Drugs money was coming in huge quantities, tax evasion, whatever you wanted, you could have it.
The item is complete.
The Bank of England was observing the developments from London and noted in a report marked secret, dated 11th of April 1969, "We need to be quite sure that the possible proliferation of trust companies, banks, etc., which in most cases would be no more than brass plates manipulating assets outside the islands, does not get out of hand. There is, of course, no objection to their providing bolt holes for non-residents, but we need to be sure that in so doing, opportunities are not created for the transfer of UK capital to the non-sterling area outside UK rules."
These small territories, the last remnants of the British Empire, which are still overseas territories today, they are still the last remnants of the British Empire. There are 14 of these overseas territories. 7 of them are bona fide tax havens, including the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands. Some of the biggest tax havens in the world today are still British.
With access to large amounts of offshore money, the euro market grew rapidly. By 1980, it had reached $500 billion. By 1988, $4.8 trillion. And by 1997, nearly 90% of all international loans were made through this market. The British Empire had sunk, leaving hardly a trace behind. But the City of London adapted and survived. The City of London, London's financial district, is a peculiar place. It has been called a city within a city, a state within a state. It is run by an organisation called the City of London Corporation, a private company that performs all the functions of a local council with a private police force and private courts.
Those of you who aren't from the UK, some of you even who are, might not be aware just how weird a thing the little City of London is within the big London. The City of London is a separate entity to the wider London, and it has its own head, the Lord Mayor, who's distinct from the Mayor, who runs the rest of London.
Every November, the city stages the Lord Mayor's Show, the world's oldest civic procession.
We await your command. Your presence is strong.
Logistics upgrade complete.
The City of London has long had this curious legal status because back in 1066, when William the Conqueror came over, the city was one of the only portions of England that he failed to conquer, and he struck a deal with the city in 1067 that allowed them to continue functioning.
To this day, the City of London is exempt from numerous laws that govern the rest of Britain. Its political system derives from the Middle Ages. The city's electorate is dominated not by its residents, but by the private businesses operating within the city. Its Lord Mayor is selected by the heads of medieval guilds.
They have a representative in the House of Commons called the Remembrancer. Apart from the clerks of the court of the House of Commons, he's the only unelected person there.
All other lobbyists have to stop, in the lobby. They're not allowed past the lobby.
The City of London has a permanent representative in the House of Commons, whose role is to report back to the City of London Corporation and to lobby Parliament on behalf of the city.
The Corporation of London, clearly, it's a unique and interesting phenomenon that should have attracted many political scientists, political economists, and economists. But I don't know of anyone who has studied systematically the Corporation of London and its impact on policy or economic policy. So we can only surmise. Some people assume or surmise that the Corporation of London is extremely powerful and is able in one way or another to shape British policy, particularly in financial methods.
Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister after the Second World War, had something to say about the City of London Corporation.
He did, yeah. So over and over again, we have seen that there is in this country another power than that which has its seat at Westminster. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control money can pursue a policy at home and abroad, contrary to that which has been decided by the people.
Revenge awaits. The unity calls us to action.
At the heart of the City of London stands the Bank of England. The Bank of England is not just a central bank, it is also a financial regulator. At the demise of empire, the Bank of England used this regulatory authority to help attract the world's banks to London. In 1972, the Bank of England issued a license to the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which set up its head office in London.
Implicitly,
within 10 years, BCCI grew into the 7th largest bank in the world. 10 years later, BCCI was bankrupt.
The Deputy Director of the CIA, Richard Kerr, said late today that the CIA did use BCCI to support CIA activities overseas.
But BCCI had not just collaborated with the world's intelligence services. It had also engaged in extensive financial fraud, money laundering, and terrorist financing.
BCCI constituted international global crime of a level that boggles the mind.
BCCI was financing terrorism. The Bank of England knew it, says the report, but instead of supervising it properly, it tried to prevent the bank's collapse.
I am saying very directly that the Bank of England had sufficient information in front of it to close BCCI 15 months earlier than it did. Millions of depositors were hurt in that process.
Unity calls us to action.
Numerous whistleblowers from BCCI had contacted the Bank of England, yet the Bank of England did nothing.
The Bank of England had plenty of time to intervene and investigate, but it did not do so because the tradition at that time, which still survives, is that, well, actually, you have to just kind of send hints and talk over lunch tables with the chaps regulating other chaps, and all would be well.
Robin Lee Pemberton, the governor of the Bank of England at the time of the collapse of BCCI, commented, "The present system of supervision has served the community well. If we closed down a bank every time we found an incidence of fraud, you would have rather fewer banks than we do at the moment."
Revenge awaits.
London was a place for banks to engage in business that was not allowed elsewhere, where senior bankers did not have to worry about the consequences of their actions.
We are ready.
This is one of the reasons why today there are more banks in London than in any other financial centre.
In Britain, nobody goes to jail. No bankers go to jail. They generally don't. They are a protected species. And that is part of the offshore business model of the UK, is to say, we will protect you. We will bring your money here. We will look after you. We're not going to put you in prison. We'll let you do what you want.
Another planet joins the unity. The Anima are restless.
Light touch regulation was one way of attracting business to London. Another was secrecy. From the 1960s onwards, City of London institutions began to establish offshore branches in former outposts of the British Empire. Their aim was to create offshore centres with strong secrecy legislation in order to attract capital from across the globe.
Swiss banking secrecy is the most famous, the most well-known. You put your money in a Swiss bank and they promise not to tell anybody, and that's one kind of secrecy. But another kind of secrecy, which is very British, is the trust. And the trust is a very slippery, complicated, and devious mechanism. Trusts emerged, the legend has it, from the time of the Crusades, when the knights would go off and fight in foreign lands, and they would leave their assets in the care of trusted stewards. What trusts do ultimately is they play with the concept of ownership. Ownership is not such a simple thing. So the settlor, the knight in this case, would hand over the assets to someone who these days would be called a trustee. It's often a lawyer. Legally, you are separated from those assets. They're not yours anymore. There's a barrier. You can't be taxed on them. Nobody's going to find anything about your connection to these assets.
In Britain's offshore jurisdictions, no qualifications are necessary to be a trustee. Anyone can set up a trust and act as a trustee. There is no registry of trusts. There are no bodies to certify that a trust has been set up.
The only persons who know about the creation of this agreement are the trustee and the settlor. There's no obligation to register it. There is no financial reporting obligation of trusts. They're not required to put annual statements onto account anywhere. So actually trusts are, to all intents and purposes, invisible arrangements.
Economist John Christensen was an economic advisor to the secrecy jurisdiction of Jersey for 10 years.
We're not talking about a few million. We're talking now about trillions. Trillions of dollars of capital, which apparently belong to nobody. For tax purposes and for other purposes, they belong to nobody. Everything, works of arts, gold bullion, racehorses, cars, real estate, not just financial assets, but a whole load of non-financial assets belong to these trusts. Sitting there, belonging to nobody. Now think that one through, because we are talking about maybe as much as $50 trillion of assets sitting offshore behind these instruments.
Well, the Cayman Islands are among several British overseas territories who have signed a new information exchange agreement with Britain and the rest of Europe to tackle tax evasion. The countries are now required to automatically provide details of the ownership of bank accounts and how they're used. Cayman became the first signatory last week.
It's important that the Cayman Islands should be recognised as the first overseas territory to sign such an agreement with the United Kingdom. And I think this importantly reflects the constructive approach that the Cayman Islands has taken in delivering our shared objective of rooting out tax evasion.
The trust lies at the core of the British secrecy model. They don't use banking secrecy. The Swiss use banking secrecy. The British, of course, are only too willing to kill off banking secrecy because they will then capture a larger market share. That's why the Brits are doing this.
Hostility research complete.
Trusts are the basic building block of Anglo-Saxon secrecy, and they form the basis from which complex offshore structures are created. Every secrecy jurisdiction offers a specific set of services, from trusts to shell companies to secret bank accounts and nominee directors. The combination of these services into complex structures, spanning multiple jurisdictions, enables the creation of secrecy structures that are almost impossible to penetrate.
An offshore structure will often have a trust kind of sitting at the top of it. The trust will be here managing the assets, kind of controlling the assets. Underneath it, the trust will own some shell companies. Each one might be in a different jurisdiction. So you might have a trust in one jurisdiction whose trustees are somewhere else, whose beneficiaries are somewhere else, which owns offshore companies somewhere else. Each of these companies might then own assets, so that they might own, a bank account, a racehorse, a yacht, a painting, a portfolio of shares or whatever.
There are numerous variations of trusts and offshore secrecy structures. There are offshore lawyers, whose work entails the creation of ever more complex and obscure structures. The aim of these structures is to hide the identity of the owners of offshore assets and allow offshore wealth to be recycled back into global markets.
But looking on the amount of money being administrated from tax havens, you see that it is a curve going like this. And all the talking we have been doing along with other wonderful people fighting against tax havens has not changed anything, you know. It is the word where you say, go on talking, and go on talking, you're interested in me, and I'm going on doing what I want to do. We know everything today because we have had the Panama Papers, we have seen it, and we are not able to act upon it. And we are not able to act upon it because the system is really protecting the few people that are having benefit from it. And these are in percentage very few people, but they are powerful. And I think in the Panama committee that I'm sitting in, the only thing that could change this is to have a public, accessible register of the beneficial ownership of trusts and of all kinds of companies. It is easy.
Revenge awaits.
The Panama Papers are a collection of leaks from the offshore law firm Mossack Fonseca. Mossack Fonseca is the 4th largest offshore law firm. The other 9 of the 10 largest offshore law firms are registered in British overseas jurisdictions.
What does the Unity will?
When countries complain to Britain about the activities run out of its offshore havens, Britain claims that these places are independent and that there is nothing it can do.
I've heard time and time again from officials in Berlin and in Paris and in Washington and in other countries that they've been told by the British government that, yes, they're well aware of what's going on in Jersey and they think it's very unfortunate, but they don't have the powers to intervene. Well, that's a straightforward lie. They do have the powers to intervene, they just choose not to.
Britain plays this kind of game of pretending, when it suits them, to pretend that these places are independent. At the end of the day, Britain appoints the governor, appoints lots of senior people in these places. They're responsible for foreign relations and defence, and also they can veto their legislation as well. So Britain has a massive degree of control. Basically, it is controlling these places, allowing them a little bit of political space.
Another planet joins the Unity.
During his time as economic advisor to Jersey, John Christensen frequently travelled to London for talks with various British government departments.
As economic advisor, I had a lot of contact with different departments. Traditionally, UK governments have tried not to interfere in the domestic affairs of places like Jersey, so it happens in a more subtle sort of way. You can go and talk to someone, either the Home Office or the Treasury, and they'd say, we're not actually particularly keen on this piece of legislation. It might be a good idea if you didn't go down that route. And over a cup of tea, that's quite a strong signal. That's a signal, go back to the island and say, they don't want you to do this.
The British government prefers not to interfere overtly. Instead, it communicates its desires through informal discussions. There is no paper trail or official statement. Discussions take place behind closed doors.
Defense upgrade complete.
The relationship that these places have with London is very much about the British establishment and people understanding each other. I mean, anybody who is British or knows British people knows that communication between us is often very subtle, and you have to kind of know the codes when people say stuff. I mean, a lot of irony involved and a lot of kind of codified language for the British establishment that people kind of understand how it works. And I think that is very much the case with the British relationship with the tax havens. I think there's a lot of understanding of what we can and can't do without anyone having to actually spell it out.
The item is complete.
By keeping its power hidden, Britain is able to claim that these jurisdictions are politically autonomous.
Independence for Cayman is not on government's agenda. That's the message being sent to the UN Special Committee on Decolonization. Attorney Steve McPhail will be representing government at the UN meeting. The committee was set up to help colonies around the world on the road to independence. But Mr. McPhail says he'll be making it clear that Cayman is not ready for that transition.
And that message is that the Premier, his cabinet, his party has no mandate from the people of the Cayman Islands to seek independence. That is the message that I will be carrying.
When the Bahamas declared independence from Britain in 1967, the offshore bankers relocated to the Cayman Islands and continued their business from there. It was the British connection that reassured bankers and their clients that their money was safe.
This British bedrock, that is what has allowed these places to become so trusted by the financial services industry and offshore finance and all these people.
We await the Unity's command.
In reality, much of the wealth administered in Britain's offshore havens is controlled from London.
The City of London, by and large, likes to do its really dirty work outside London. There might, heaven forbid, be a regulator who actually takes the job seriously and starts to prosecute them for fraud in London. So better to do the frauds offshore in Gibraltar or Jersey, where there's much less risk that a serious prosecution will ever happen.
Deals are often discussed and concluded in London, but then registered offshore for tax, transparency and regulatory purposes.
What they allow the city to do is to get involved in dirty business, but then when the scandal hits, to say, well, they're kind of independent, there's nothing we can do about those places, that's not us, that's tax haven activity, and we're the city, you know, we're not involved in that kind of stuff. So it's an incredibly kind of convenient relationship.
The City of London has shaped the way in which Jersey, Guernsey and the British Overseas Territories have developed as tax havens. I see these places as the Frankensteins created by the City of London.
Today, the UK is the world's largest provider of international financial services.
The UK has an almost unique role in global finance. If you look at data, the kind of data that we've constructed in the Financial Secrecy Index, you can see the relative shares of each country in the global provision of financial services exports. That's financial services to non-residents. Now, there are two big centres, and everything else is quite small in comparison.
The two large centres are the United States, with around 19% of the global market, and the United Kingdom and its offshore jurisdictions, which have around 25% of the global market.
And if you add to that other jurisdictions, ex-colonies, but recently independent, fairly recently, by which I mean Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe even Dubai and Bahrain, and Cyprus, then you reach a figure of nearly 40%. And I think that figure represents better the position of London in the global financial market.
The soldiers left, the administrators left, all the colonies, but they still kept a significant degree of control over the financial flows from these former parts of empire and the rest of the world. So you could describe it as a second empire, Britain's second empire, sort of hidden financial empire spanning large parts of the globe.
Production of the item is complete.
At the time of the British Empire, the City of London was the world's largest global financial centre. Not only Britain's colonies, but also independent countries did their banking in London and used the empire's currency for trade and financing.
Our thoughts are one.
As the empire declined, so too did the City of London. The establishment of the London Euro market enabled City of London banks to continue to exploit their empire-era networks and expertise, and the creation of secrecy jurisdictions gave banks access to large amounts of cheap money. International banks from across the globe set up branches in London and Britain's offshore jurisdictions in order to take advantage of this new system.
This system has taken the place of the occupation, up till 62. For France, I don't know for England, but about the same time, England were physically present in India, for instance, or in other colonies. And when you look at the money flows through the tax havens, they are increasing when we withdraw from the colonies. are still plundering developing countries as former colonial powers.
It was insufficient.
Wealthy individuals, organized crime, and corporations shifted their wealth offshore in exchange for secrecy and no tax. And as countries around the world began to deregulate and open their economies, it became ever easier to do so. Today, as much as half of all global offshore wealth may be hidden in Britain's secrecy jurisdictions. One of the losers is Africa, whose flight capital flows mostly into the modern British spider's web.
I think it's no coincidence that Britain's offshore empire emerged more or less at the same time as the collapse of the former empire.
We tend to think of Africa as being a huge net debtor to the rest of the world. But that was the extent of their debts at the end of 2008, 177 billion.
The debt of sub-Saharan African nations stood at $177 billion in 2008. Yet the wealth these countries' elites had moved offshore between 1970 and 2008 is estimated at $944 billion, over 5 times their foreign debt.
$944 billion. Do the maths. Far from being a net debtor, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is a net creditor to the rest of the world.
As capital moved offshore, African nations borrowed money from international banks at high interest. Over time, these debts became so great that they may never be repaid. Secrecy jurisdictions were starving developing nations of their wealth and their tax revenues.
For a long time, a lot of developing countries, including recently Ecuador, have been trying to set up a UN tax body, which is of a higher value than what is currently there, which is the UN Tax Committee. And every time this has happened, it has gotten blocked. During the financing for development process in Addis Ababa last year, I think it was the UK and the US that blocked attempts again to set up this World Tax Organization. So why would they not want to have democratic decision-making in global decisions on how tax gets collected across borders? I don't understand this. As long as we have cross-border activity that involves both criminal and legal activity, as long as we're unable to separate the two, this is going to continue to be a problem.
Western nations block attempts to provide greater transparency of international financial flows and the implementation of global standards for the collection of tax across borders, whilst elites in developing nations use offshore centres to hide their wealth offshore.
The oil from Gabon has not benefited people in Gabon. And this is true for the copper in Zambia, for the gold in Mozambique or in Mali. They have benefited the company that do extract it and their shareholders. It has benefited the corrupt elite in the country.
In developing countries, the offshore system of tax havens has facilitated the looting of these countries by their elites. It has enabled them to steal the money and keep it safe somewhere else.
Illicit financial flows, because the anonymity that drives them creates incentives for people in positions of power to be corrupt. This is why there's a group of countries where development progress is so difficult. It's that the incentives of individuals and the ability to pursue them through all the mechanisms that underpin illicit flows outweigh the type of mechanisms that lead you to a powerful, representative, effective state that can start to deliver development.
Submit to the unity or be eradicated.
Worldwide, developing countries lose over $1 trillion every year in capital flight and tax evasion. Most of this wealth flows into large Western nations, like the United States and Britain, and enables their currencies to stay strong, whilst developing nations' currencies remain weak. But illicit flows into Western nations also had another unexpected side effect. The economies of the United States and Britain began to financialize. The origins of this financialization, or de-industrialization, go back to the 1960s.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. President Johnson, meanwhile, let it be known that the FBI is closely watching all anti-war activity.
In the 1960s, U.S. economist Michael Hudson was working at Chase Manhattan Bank on Wall Street as Chase's balance of payments economist.
During the 1960s, the United States balance of payments deficit was entirely a result of foreign military expenditures.
Dollars were flowing out of the United States as a result of the cost of the Vietnam War. The United States attempted to prevent the dollars flowing to Vietnam from being deposited in foreign banks.
The government asked Chase to set up a branch in Saigon during the Vietnam War. And as you can imagine, it didn't have windows. It was sort of a fortress. It lost money, but the government went to Chase because it said, if you don't get this money that's being thrown off by the military in Vietnam, then it's going to go into French banks. It'll get to General de Gaulle, and you know what he's going to do every month. He's going to cash it in for gold. That's what the United States was trying to stop.
We await the Unity's command.
The U.S. was not successful in stopping the outflow of money, so it began to hatch a different plan. In 1967, Michael Hudson was handed a memo by a former State Department employee.
In 1967, I was given by a former State Department employee in the elevator at Chase Manhattan a memo from the State Department urging that Chase Manhattan would take the lead in helping the United States become the Switzerland of the world, meaning the flight capital. The State Department, through Chase, asked me to estimate how much money do you think is available if America were to become the new Switzerland, and how do we do it? The plan was to organize offshore banking centers in the Caribbean and elsewhere, and the hot money wouldn't come directly into Chase because that wouldn't be nice and very legal. What happened was that the Latin American criminals, other criminals, drug dealers, all sorts of organized crime would put their money in the offshore Caribbean banks, and these offshore banks would then deposit the inflow in the head office.
By moving offshore dollars back into the United States, the U.S. was able to stop the outflow of dollars and support the value of its currency.
Defilers encroach upon us.
Every country looks to its foreign exchange rate, and the foreign exchange rate is not only imports and exports, it's capital movements. And if you look at the International Monetary Fund's monthly international financial statistics, you have sort of a steady balance of trade, a steady immigrant remittances. What goes up and down are called errors and omissions. What the United Nations and the IMF call errors and omissions are flight capital. It's the reason that it's omitted is they don't like to really look at this. In the 1930s, Roy Ovid Hall, economist for the U.S. Commerce Department, wanted to include criminal movements in the balance of payment statistics. And Congress got very upset. I was told in Washington, the argument was, we're a Christian country. We don't want to report crime. It's just, don't look at it. And they forbid him to include criminal money in the balance of payments. I guess now you call it errors and omissions. You don't call it criminal inflow and outflow.
Not enough crystal.
In the 1960s and 70s, Britain was faced with a similar dilemma as the United States. Money was flowing out, and this decreased the value of the pound. Britain realized that it, too, could support the value of its currency by opening its domestic markets to the trillions of dollars passing through its offshore havens. But just as in the United States, this had an unexpected side effect.
The British banks today, just as in the 19th century, don't put their money into British manufacturing. They put their money into real estate speculation, into financial speculation, foreign currency trade. So the financialization of London has helped deindustrialize the country because it's enabled sterling to be supported by this huge inflow of hot money, this inflow of drug dealing money and criminal money and tax evasion money all over the world that is going to London instead of going to Switzerland, Liechtenstein, or the Caribbean.
With the silent backing of the United States, Britain's offshore havens grew rapidly, and before long, the offshore system developed into the world's dominant international financial market. Few were aware how this market functioned. In 1986, economist John Christensen went offshore to investigate. He applied for a position at the Jersey office of one of the world's major accounting firms.
At Deloitte & Touche, I was working in what's called company and trust administration, straightforward offshore stuff. I went offshore specifically to work in that area because that's where you're dealing with the offshore companies, the shell companies, the offshore trusts, and you're administering them. That way I could see from working inside a big global accounting firm exactly what the clients were doing. I had complete access to all the client files. And over the course of my period of working with Deloitte & Touche, I investigated over 100 of their clients offshore, and this is what I found. There were some insider traders, some market rigging, some avoiding disclosure of conflicts of interest, illicit arms trading, illicit political campaign donations, contract kickbacks, bribery, fraudulent invoicing, trade mispricing, and at the bottom, tax evasion. Okay? This is what the clients were doing. The basis of a sample of the clients that I looked at, not a single client was involved in what I would regard as genuinely legitimate activity. They were all involved in some kind of tax dodging or worse.
I met with Carl Levin, who used to be an American senator, and he made a lot of inquiries into private banking, asking questions to the bankers. What do you think the percentage is among your clients that are using these companies for legitimate purposes? And the answer was, I believe that 99.9% of my clients are using these companies for illicit purposes. This is a reality. This is American bankers telling what they are doing. And it's exactly the same thing with UK bankers helping their clients to have accounts in Panama or in Bermuda or in Cayman Islands.
We await the Unity's command.
Whatever the Unity
Secrecy jurisdictions are heavily used for fraudulent and grey area financial activities. Areas where secrecy is not just desirable, but a necessity.
What does the Unity will?
Legitimate financial activity has no need for the secrecy offshore havens provide, nor a desire to pay the high fees offshore banks and law firms charge. Today, close to half of the world's secrecy jurisdictions are British dependencies. In public, these jurisdictions claim they are transparent, and their financial services sectors are engaged in legitimate financial activities.
Our economy is not based on secrecy. It's based on transparency. It's based on a sound regulatory environment. It's based on good governance and good government. With a British government legal system. That's what our financial institutions are based on.
Well, tonight we have a response from the head of Cayman Finance after a group of US-based anti-tax evasion activists announced plans to travel to Cayman to draw attention to what they feel is corporate tax evasion. Finance Chairman Mr. Richard Cole says he's encouraging the group to visit and says our financial sector has nothing to hide.
I would say if anybody wants to come to Cayman to find out what's coming, what we do here, come on down. We have no secrets here.
Shall it be? Planet item ready.
When I went to the Cayman Islands back in 2008, I think it was, I called the government spokesman and he said, okay, we have had an order from on high that nobody is allowed to speak to you. You are off limits.
In 2011, journalist Nicholas Shaxson released Treasure Islands, a groundbreaking book about the offshore system.
The author of a series of international media reports says he would welcome a debate with Cayman Finance Chair Tony Travers. Mr. Travers recently called Nicholas Shaxson an imbecile with the understanding of an 11-year-old.
There are always going to be the politics of envy. Now, the politics of envy are exacerbated by imbeciles who don't actually understand what's going on in the Cayman Islands. I don't know what he's talking about. And furthermore, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
The Cayman Islands is the 5th largest financial centre in the world. It hosts 80,000 registered companies, over 3/4 of the world's hedge funds, and $1.9 trillion in deposits. It has a population of 60,000, roughly equivalent to New York's homeless population.
Hostility research complete.
A strange mixture of characters populate the offshore world.
We must act.
British ex-public schoolboys, members of the world's intelligence services, global criminals, assorted lords and ladies, and bankers galore.
We seek minds to make our own.
With so much at stake for so many wealthy and powerful individuals, it may come as no surprise that Britain's offshore havens have developed their own curious mechanisms to prevent information from leaking out.
For many people who work offshore and who don't like what they're doing, it's very hard indeed to dissent, because they will be attacked personally with a degree of viciousness which is quite extraordinary. Most of the time, the instruments of suppression are relatively sophisticated. You won't get promotion by doing this, or your family won't like it.
It's not generally, let's slam them in prison. That's far too crude. We are talking about very substantially, you know, the establishment, the British establishment in these cases. The mechanisms are very, very subtle. Sort of ostracism is one way of doing it. These peculiar mechanisms for, you know, if someone tries to blow the whistle, you find all sorts of methods that aren't the most, you know, just fire them, you give them far too much work to do, you steer them in a different direction.
One person who is intimately familiar with how suppression works offshore is former Jersey Senator and Health Minister Stuart Sivray. In 2009, he leaked a report on a rogue nurse suspected of killing patients at Jersey's hospital.
It all came to a head during a state debate on Tuesday the 10th of March. Senator Stuart Sivray brought the sitting to a standstill, claiming Senator Jimmy Pershard had sworn at him and told him to go and top himself. Senator Pershard denied the claim, saying, "I absolutely refute that." But less than a week later, he was forced to admit he had lied. Senator Pershard has now admitted that on another occasion he did tell Senator Stuart Sivray to go and do everyone a favour and slit his wrists.
I was arrested at my house one morning by 6 plainclothes police officers. There were another 2 specialist data search police officers on hand, and also another 2 police officers in full body armour of one of those battering rams they kind of use in drugs raids. So 10 police officers descended on me without a search warrant. The property was turned over from top to bottom. All of the computers were seized and searched. All kinds of private constituency data was stolen by the police.
What does the Unity will?
Shortly after we began filming, a police officer exited the police station. As he hurried past, he grinned at the camera. The officer was on his way to test the sirens on his motorbike, which he did at intervals throughout much of the remainder of the interview.
When it came to prosecuting,
They're not the fragile foes we imagined.
Stuart Sivray was prosecuted under the Data Protection Law.
Now, when the authorities were prosecuting me, I claimed that this was a legitimate public interest disclosure defence, and I, with an expert witness, was able to produce a set of reports that effectively destroyed.
We'll consider it. Last chance.
In reaction to this,
surrender.
the magistrates ruled that Stuart Sivray's defence case that he had leaked the report in the public interest would no longer be admissible, but continued to prosecute him all the same, without a defense case. Over the past 7 years, Stuart Sivray has been repeatedly taken to court and imprisoned 3 times. He does not know when or if the persecution will end, nor does he know when he will find himself behind bars again.
We must act.
To look at Jersey from the outside, it looks like it's got a prosecution system, it looks like it's got a court and a legislature, but none of it's real. It's a Potemkin village. None of these systems in Jersey meet the test of being objective or actually functioning properly.
The experience that Stuart Sivray had is, you know, he's perhaps at the blunter end of the scale. He was simply suppressed and taken to court on trumped-up charges.
The item is complete. We have cleansed the planet of heat.